The Pope recently made a very interesting comment about the 2024 United States presidential election, where he said that voters should decide their choice for president on the basis of who is the lesser evil. And this comment made my eyebrows perk up for several reasons, and one of them being the fact that this is the leader of the Catholic Church, a institution that has a well-established philosophical tradition on the topic of evil and other topics, making such a statement. But then I also began thinking about how endemic this kind of thinking is to most people's political considerations. So in this video, we're going to actually walk through the Pope's statements, and I'm going to tell you my problems with it. Then I'm going to give you a historical backdrop on the problem of evil and its relationship with politics, and how we as thinking people, as moral people, should deal with it. But my friends, before we get into all that, hope all of you are doing well. I am Christian Watts. Thank you so much for being here. If you enjoy political and social commentary with a philosophical bent, which you will not get anywhere else, then I must implore you, please like, share, comment, subscribe, do whatever you can to ensure that our message goes to the stratosphere and it is successful. My friends, even if you disagree with me, this message is so important. Thank you guys so much for being here. Now, please enjoy the video. So, the Pope had a recent stop where he was talking to a set of voters, or rather he was addressing a set of voters in America. And he made several comments that I think are quite interesting and provide much food for thought, but also that I think are actually quite offensive to people who understand the nature of evil and how it operates within political context. Here is the Pope saying that people should decide whoever wins the presidential election in America on the basis of their conscience in reference to the idea of lesser evils. Go.
Ambedue sono contro la vita, sia quello che butta via i migranti, sia quello che uccide i bambini. Nella morale politica, in genere si dice che non votare è brutto, non è buono, si deve votare. E si deve scegliere il male minore. Chi è il male minore? Quella signora o quel signore? Non so, ognuno in coscienza pensi e faccia questo. Fare un aborto è uccidere un essere umano. Ti piace la parola? Non ti piace, ma è uccidere. E questo la Chiesa non è chiusa perché non permette l'aborto. La Chiesa non permette l'aborto perché uccide, è un assassinio, è un assassinio. E questo dobbiamo avere le cose chiare. Mandare via i migranti, non lasciarli sviluppare, non lasciare avere vita è una cosa brutta e cattiveria lì. Mandare via un bambino dal seno della mamma è un assassinio, perché c'è vita. In queste cose dobbiamo parlare.
Wow. Well, there are several things immediately that are concerning in what he said. First of all, he does something that I call mixing moral categories. What is that? Well, he says at first that abortion is wrong, which it is. But then he says that denying entry to migrants is also wrong. Now, he's speaking about these things in the same breath, which must mean that he considers them both to at least be, if not on the same level, at least in the same category. And this is buttressed by the fact that the Pope, before he said these things, first said that you must decide the election on the basis of who is lesser evil. So, the Pope therefore believes that denying entry to a migrant, in other words, national self-determination, is at the same moral level as terminating a life, or in his words, assassinating a life, i.e. abortion. This is what we call mixing categories. When you blur two or more actions that are wholly distinct, but are only speciously similar. This is also called a category error. Abortion does clearly not belong in the same category as denying entry to a migrant because they both occupy two different concepts. It is true, both involve a human life, but not all things that involve a human life are exactly the same. I'll give you a very clear example of this. Driving involves a human life, and so does hunting. Hunting and driving both involve human lives in very different ways. Does that mean we treat hunting in the same way we treat driving? Of course not. Hunting has its own range of implications, as does driving. And if you were to treat hunting and driving as indistinguishable, you may have a lot of different problems. And I don't even want to begin to theorize what those problems might be, but the case is clear enough that those two things are wholly distinct enough in their character that they should be treated as separately different things. Only in a worldview where it is a totalizing understanding of moral issues, where everything exists on one single plane of thought, and then can be considered with that plane of thought with no reference to distinctions, can the Pope's ideas in this regard make sense. And that worldview would be social justice if I were to pick out one category in the realm of ideas. Because social justice does fundamentally say that migrant issues and abortion issues are one and the same because they both impact how people move in a particular society. For the social justice advocate, migrant issues impact how the downtrodden, in their view, poor migrant, who may be disadvantaged by systemic factors, exist in society, whereas in their view, abortion issues impact the reproductive rights in their view of a woman. Now, there's another error the Pope's formulation here commit. The Pope mixes up positive rights with negative rights. So the right to life is the most fundamental safeguard for not only the preservation of mankind, that is its very basic function, but also the preservation of society. If you don't have a moral system in which life is at least the primary, if not the ultimate value, and the preservation thereof is made a task by all the institutions in that society, you cannot have a system in which society can exist beyond perpetual conflict and enmity. This is the observation that many of the philosophers of the 18th century actually made, that mankind must cooperate in order to build civilization. The opposite is just sheer antagonism. Now, beyond that, however, that is the protection of life is not granting anything. It does not give you anything. It rather preserves what is already there. Whereas giving a migrant access into your country is not the same thing as protecting a life, because you are granting them something they didn't have in the first place. In other words, the Pope considers rights, in this case, to mean the same thing as safeguarding what is already there and giving what is not already there, which you don't have. In other words, he believes that certain people are morally entitled to things they don't have by virtue of merely living. This is the doctrine of positive rights that says that freedom and being able to be free and therefore flourish in life is largely dependent on what you can get in terms of healthcare, in terms of clean water, in terms of employment, so on and so forth. Now, all those things are good to have, but these things are not on the same moral level as defending somebody from an assassination or from murder. In fact, there are two wholly distinct things. They are wholly distinct because your life, no matter if someone, because your life is not something that is granted by someone who has the ability to produce a certain good for you, your life is already there for you. Whereas healthcare or access into a country is something that is granted to you and is also subject to different considerations that your own individual life is not subject to. So the Pope, beyond mixing moral categories, also confuses moral theories and tries to paint them as one and the same. I'm offended, personally. But beyond this, there's another consideration. The Pope seems to be standing against thousands of years of Catholic philosophical consideration on the topic of evil. Now, let me just be very clear about this. I am not a Catholic. In fact, I keep my personal faith private because I do not believe it is my job to speak to only people that agree with me theologically. I believe it is my job to speak to as many people as possible. I'll be honest, I'm a Protestant Christian, but that really is no one's business Because I'm not just speaking to Christians, I'm speaking to pagans, I'm speaking to atheists, I'm speaking to Jews, I'm speaking to Muslims, I'm speaking to everybody who is willing to think deeper about things happening in our country. Having said that, within the Catholic tradition itself, the Pope is willing to compromise on evil. And he says in the video that I showed you guys that political wisdom demands that we consider the issue of lesser evils. So he accepts a mediocre line of thinking, i.e., that considering a lesser evil is acceptable in the first place. And then he proceeds with it with no revision or objection. And this is the leader of the Catholic Church, the emissary of thousands of years of church tradition. This is absolutely ludicrous to me. So I immediately went back to the Summa Theologica, which is the magnum opus of St. Thomas Aquinas, who is the definitive philosopher in the Catholic tradition, who set the standard for the other Catholic philosophers to follow in terms of his moral theory and his theology. He is one of the most referenced and one of the most famous and noted philosophers. And in the Summa, he has a section where he is asking the question, what is the cause of evil? And in one of those sections, he asks whether good can be the cause of evil. Well, in this section, we're not going to go through all of it, obviously, because there's a massive section, and it would belie the point I'm trying to get to. But in this particular section, he defines evil quite clearly. He said, for example, and I quote, "Evil is the absence of good, which is natural and due to a thing." And then he goes on to say, "But that anything fail from its natural and due disposition can only come from some cause drawing it out of its proper disposition." So in other words, evil is the deviation of a thing which is already good, and the only thing that can cause something that is good to become bad is if the good thing is interrupted. This makes perfect sense. The only thing that can stop for example, a tennis ball from being able to hit the other side of the court is if another tennis racket were to whack it. This is obviously a very minimized definition of what he's trying to say, but it perfectly encapsulates the points. And he goes on to say that the nature of good is such that evil requires good to exist. And he kind of describes it as a parasite. He goes on to say, and I'll continue with this. "For it is shown that good is the subject of evil, and evil has no formal cause. Rather, it is a privation of form. Likewise, neither has it a final cause. Rather, it is a privation of order to the proper end, since not only the end has the nature of good, but also useful, which is order to the end. Evil, however, has a cause by way of an agent, not directly, but accidentally." So St. Thomas is quite clear here about the nature of evil. It is a privation, it is a deficiency, it is a lack of, it is an absence in his view. This does not seem like something you want to compromise with, because to compromise with this would be to compromise the good. Now, this single passage kind of sets a backdrop for a big debate that's been happening in ethics for a long time. And you guys may know this debate. It's called the debate between the good and the right. The good, if you go all the way back to Aristotle's Ethics, he says everything tends towards some good. Well, the good is just the ultimate fulfillment of that particular thing, because everything has a purpose, according to this particular formulation, and St. Thomas took directly from Aristotle. Well, the right says, okay, the good is what everything tends towards, but the right is what all actions must conform to, and otherwise they deviate from a necessary course for humans to coherently act. And there's been this dispute. Should the good, what everything naturally tends towards, stand above the right, what is necessary for actions to conform to if we do not want to deviate, or is there some in between? This is a very complex topic, but the term, the common good that you guys might hear, actually is a result of the tension between these two ideas. The right being the abstract principles which are supposed to guide action, and the good being the more intimate idea of what that thing should be going towards. Anyway, putting that ethical dispute aside, the Pope is willing to compromise with a privation that by his own tradition is seen as a lack of, which is quite compelling to me in the sense that it shows that this Pope does not have any outward consideration of the tenets of his own, that his own faith is supposed to represent. Now, I want to make a distinction between moral evil and moral ugliness, because I think that this oftentimes gets confused. Politics is not a matter of choosing between lesser of two evils. It is rather choosing about what form of moral ugliness you're going to tolerate or go against. Here's what I mean. Moral evil is when something deviates from its proper ordering, from its proper form, what it's supposed to conform to the extent that it seeks the destruction of that thing. So if I'm going to be morally evil towards someone's property, I'm going to ensure they cannot use their property in the way it is meant to be used. Now, moral ugliness is when there is a deviation from the proper ordering of a particular thing, but the deviation does not destroy that thing. It keeps it intact, but in a disfigured way. So this is the difference between destroying a car and damaging a car. Well, politics is very much a game of moral ugliness. There is oftentimes a desire to compromise between particular issues in a sense that whatever the result is, it ultimately leaves us in a place that is not desirable, but ultimately it doesn't destroy the system. Now, it can destroy the system in some cases, and there are particular instances of that are very important. But the most important part is this. If we treat every single action as a discussion between the lesser evil and the greater evil, we can't actually understand evil for what it is. And we can't actually understand morality for what it is either. I would personally choose to go against all evil. And if you're going to have this idea that we have to necessarily choose evil, then I would then encourage you to evaluate the conditions of your society and ask yourself if that is a society worth living in. But it's obvious to me that the Pope is doing none of these things in that particular moment, that he is being utterly destructive by refusing to engage in the deeper implications of this issue, so much so that he is besmirching the tenets of his own faith, or those who influenced the people who ultimately also influenced the future of the Catholic Church. It's rather disturbing. It is rather unfortunate. But I think there is a bunch of lessons we can take from this, as I've laid out. And I think that we can all avoid the fate of falling into moral ignorance when it comes to this particular topic. My friends, like, share, comment, subscribe, do whatever you can to get our message out there. My friends, study history, study philosophy, remain morally convicted, and please stay pensive. Bye, guys.